My name is Naomi Inglar. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Tulane Prevention Research Center. I want to thank everyone for being here, especially our speakers, and the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine Student Government Association for also being a co-sponsor today. Thank you guys very much. Today is the first of our Spring 2018 Innovations in Public Health Research and Practice Seminar Series. We are very excited to have three wonderful presenters today talking about food choices in the environment. To go over some housekeeping, if you did not sign in outside on the computers, please do so. This is very important for us as we report this to our funders and justify the reason why we have these seminars. Please also take an evaluation form. Again, it's really important that we evaluate what we're doing, and we want to make sure that we're providing you all with the training that you want here. Other housekeeping, we are using the hashtag Tulane Seminar, hashtag Innovations in Public Health. We're live tweeting, and recording of this will be posted on our YouTube within about a week or two. So please stay tuned for that. Also, if you signed in, we'll make sure that you get a link to that YouTube. And without further ado, I will introduce our speakers. Diego Rose is a professor and director of the Nutrition and Food Security Program in the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine at Tulane University. He has worked in the food and nutrition field at both the local and federal levels in this country, and has worked internationally in Mozambique, South Africa, Mexico, and Guatemala. Here in the school, Rose teaches graduate courses in nutrition assessment and food and nutrition policy. Amelia Willett-Smith got her Master's of Science in Nutrition at Cornell University. She is a PhD student in the Global Community Health and Behavioral Sciences Department. Her research interests include food security and sustainable nutrition in the United States. Brittany Kovacs is the Nutrition Program Coordinator in the GCHB Department at the Tulane School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. Prior to moving to New Orleans, she received her Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and Sociology from Emory University and served as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Republic of Georgia. She completed both her Master of Social Work and Master of Public Health at Tulane. In her current role, Brittany coordinates and contributes to research activities on several grant-funded projects related to nutrition, food access, and the environmental impacts of diet. Please help me welcome our speakers.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I'm Diego Rose, and as Naomi mentioned, the title of our seminar is Food Choices in the Environment, the Carbon Footprint of Our Diet. I wonder if somebody in the back could kill the lights so it's a little easier to, or particularly the ones up front. So this is work that is funded by the Wellcome Trust, and let's see here. I want to start with talking a little bit about the problem. It's actually a two-sided problem. On the one hand, there's the health problem, high rates of chronic disease, mortality, and morbidity. I'm talking about cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes. But there's also an environmental problem, and chief among those is global warming. About a year ago, NASA and NOAA released a report that showed that 2016 was the warmest year on record. And in fact, 15 of the 16 warmest years on record came after 2000. Just in November, there was another report that was issued showing that humans were to blame for global warming. This is a massive report. Hundreds of scientists were involved in it. They came up with a couple of other points that are noteworthy. They, for the first time, are linking extreme weather events, like what we saw in Texas and Florida, to global climate change. Also predicting that because of sea level rise, there will be the incidence of daily flooding in 25 Gulf Coast and Atlantic cities will be increasing. So that's worrisome. Now, at the root of this is, or one of the contributors, dominant contributors to the problem is agriculture. The agricultural, livestock, and forestry sector accounts for 30% of human greenhouse gas emissions. That's worldwide. And diet is important for both. That's the title. You all know how diet's connected to health outcomes. If you don't, you should take our nutrition classes. But the other way in which diet is connected to this dual-headed problem is that food demand drives agricultural production. What we choose to eat, what the students bought for us today, which seems to be low carbon footprint, if I got the right idea here. What we buy at the supermarket, what we eat at restaurants, all drives what the agricultural sector produces. And the agricultural sector has a big contribution here. There's been a review of studies that show that changing current diets could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50% of what comes from diet as it is now. But there's a research gap in this whole area, which is that most of the studies done have been outside the U.S. Europe has taken the lead on this. And most studies everywhere, most studies have been done at the aggregated population level. I mean, one data point for a country. So you don't really get any idea of who's doing what inside the country. What are the differences? And that doesn't allow us to examine the links between individuals' diets, how sustainable they are, and what the health outcomes are, because we don't have individual outcomes. We just have 1 point for the whole country. We also don't have, are not able to look at individual demographic differences in people's diet behaviors and how that relates to sustainability. We can't target interventions because of that. And our policy analysis is weaker because of that, because we can't predict how a distribution of people will react to a policy change. We just have 1 point. So let me talk about the specific aims of the research that we'll present today. First is to develop and implement some sort of method to link environmental diet and health to individuals. We want to focus this on individuals. And the second is how can we describe how individual characteristics relate to dietary greenhouse gas emissions? We're going to conduct a policy simulation on the impacts of diet change. And finally, we're going to examine dietary recommendations in other countries and their carbon footprints. These last two will be done. The third one is going to be done by Amelia, and the fourth one is going to be done by Brittany. So these are actually 3 separate papers that we've put together. I'm going to present the first one, linking environmental impacts to individual food choices, the carbon footprint of U.S. diets in the 2005-2010 NHANES. And for this particular study, we want to develop this method to describe greenhouse gas emissions of diets of U.S. individuals. And to do that, we need to compile a database of the environmental impacts of foods and somehow link that to what people say they're eating, a database of U.S. diets. So that's where we're headed for as a prime objective. The second objective is, can we describe demographic correlates of greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on gender? In particular, do men's diets have a higher carbon footprint? It's a hypothesis. If so, what are the differences in consumption of specific food groups that lead to this? And finally, is there some impact of those choices? Is the overall diet quality different between men and women as measured by the Healthy Eating Index? I'll get to that. So let me talk a little bit about the methods we used. First, I'll start with the data sources. We looked at this thing called What We Eat in America, WOWEA, which is the dietary component of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES. This is a validated 24-hour food recall. So they're asking everything that you ate yesterday. And we're just looking at this for the day 1 diets. There are 2 days available. We're just looking at day 1 diets in today's presentation. And the sample we have is 2005 to 2010. That involves some 13,000 individuals, and we're looking at just adults 18 to 65 years of age. And they're eating 7,000 or so food items and dishes, everything from a wrap to a pizza to a piece of fruit. And the other data source that we're going to use for this is something that we created, and it's called the Database of Food Impacts on the Environment for Linking to Diets. Got to have an acronym. So this is called Data Field. And this is an interesting thing. This is based on life cycle assessment of foods. Our colleagues at Michigan scoured the environmental systems industrial ecology literatures to pull out what are the studies that show the environmental impacts of foods. And that life cycle assessment is kind of like an accounting method that traces through growing a food crop, all the things that go into it, all the things that come out, and what are the impacts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or energy used or water, et cetera, et cetera. So this was an extensive review, data extracted from more than 300 food LCA studies. And the focus for this paper and mostly in that database is on greenhouse gas emissions in primary production, meaning up until the farm gate, the farm production part, which turns out to be the major part of the environmental impact. Okay, so those are the two main data sources. This is the NHANES, this is the Food Environmental Impact Database that we developed. And that's actually a real challenge because the NHANES has 7,000 different as-consumed foods. Think pizza, for example, or wrap, for that matter, since you're eating it. And then the food environmental impact data is at the commodity level. And there's maybe only 200 or 300 commodities that are studied. And so there might be information on lettuce, or sort of greens, or wheat, or tomatoes, but not necessarily on the tomato sauce that goes into a pizza. How do we connect those two? We found this food commodities intake database, something that EPA produces to look at pesticide residues in foods. And that allowed us to connect the impacts that we put together with NHANES that already existed through this as sort of a translation approach. Now that actually turns out to be quite complex. Here's the flow chart for trying to do that. Thank you to Amelia for putting this together. This is, I'm not going to go into this, obviously. I just wanted to point out that it's complicated, a bunch of programming to pull all this together. But I do want to give you a little intuition on what I'm talking about. And that what we have, there's a recipe file for all of the foods that people eat. And if you search there, you might see that there's lots of different, if you put pizza in the search box, there's lots of different pizzas. And if you look then, if you click on it and see what happens, you'll get, for example, if you choose pizza with pepperoni, thin crust, so there's a lot of people in the NHANES that ate this food. And it takes that pizza and translates it into commodities, wheat flour, tomato, milk, beef, etc. The things I was just talking about, where we have the information on environmental impacts that we got from the literature. So we're able to actually map the environmental impact literature to every food that everybody eats through these recipe files. That's the main strategy for that. Once we do all that, we get to some results. And the first result I want to show you is a chart of greenhouse gas emissions from selected foods. And the units here are kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of edible portion. Carbon dioxide equivalents is just a way to put carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane all on the same scale because they have different global warming potentials. So we want to have everything on the same scale of global warming potential. And when we do that, we see that fruits and vegetables relatively low impact, under a couple of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilogram of edible portion. It starts increasing when you look at protein foods, for example, particularly animal protein foods, and then kind of gets blown off the chart when you start looking at beef. It turns out that ruminant animals, because of the methane that they release in fermentation and manure, are 35 times the kind of impact that you'll see on some vegetables. Okay, so now what we did is we connected these impacts to all of the impacts of each person that they ate in a day, added it all up, and took an average, and what we found is that there's 4.9 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita per day on average for the U.S. What does that mean? Well, we compared it to the literature, and it's within range of what we're seeing from other studies, so that makes us feel good. But the goal really wasn't to get a single point. That was what we were trying to get beyond. And so actually what we wanted to do is get a distribution of individuals what does it look like in the whole population if we rank everybody in terms of the lowest to the highest? And sort of, this is just a frequency histogram, which you should be familiar with from your biostats classes. What if we divided this sample into five equal portions, quintiles of greenhouse gas emissions, and looked at the low and the high end diets, if you will? And we actually looked at that comparison, and the highest quintile, and this is scaled per 1,000 calories, is 41% of total greenhouse gas emissions from diet. That's the top quintile is consuming 41% or responsible for 41%. The lowest only 8%. So we're seeing a difference here within the population of 5 times. There's people eating at this end that are 5 times as impactful in their choices than people eating at the bottom end. Now we have a paper where we're looking at what are the dietary components of that. But one of the things we wanted to do with an individual analysis is also look at the differences in gender. And so that's what I'm going to focus on now. Mean greenhouse gas emissions by gender, what we're seeing is that women have a far lower carbon footprint, if you will, than men. It's not even 2/3 of what men's carbon footprint is. So that's pretty significant. Of course, if you're thinking about it, women are smaller and they eat less and on average have much lower calorie intake. So their calories are a lot lower. So it's not surprising that it would be less. But what if we scaled it by calories? We see that even still, that this is significantly different, that women's dietary choices now, not the amount that they're eating, but the quality of their diet is actually about 10% lower in greenhouse gas emissions. It has a smaller carbon footprint than men's. So why is that? What are the foods that they're doing that making that happen, and does it matter? Go look through a chart of food group intakes, comparing women and men, and with all of these, I'm going to be looking at cup equivalents per 1,000 calories. Okay, and so women from this are eating 1.4 servings or cup equivalents per 1,000 calories, about 1/3 of a cup per 1,000 calories more than men. That's statistically significant. Here's the whole chart. Let me walk you through it. If you look at fruits and vegetables, women are eating more fruits and more vegetables, significantly so. In terms of grains, higher grains, and that's coming from whole grains, about the same on refined grains. If you look at protein foods, a little bit less on protein foods, and if we zoom in on that, what are the protein food group intakes by gender? What we're seeing is that the big difference here is in meat, that women are consuming less meat per 1,000 calories, not total, but the sort of the quality of their diet is significantly lower in terms of the meat intake. It's about the same in poultry and seafood, and it's higher in plant foods. If we move on to dairy foods, they're eating a little bit more. They're eating a little bit more in oil, a little bit less in solid fats, and no difference in added sugars. And so what the take-home message from this chart is that every place where women are significantly different than men, they're making the right decisions. This is at least in terms of diet. I don't know about that in terms of life in general. It is International Women's Day, so a shout out about that. But the overall message in terms of those healthful choices is that if you look at the Healthy Eating Index, a scale of 0 to 100 to sort of rank people's diets or to score people's diets, 100 being the best, women are 2.5 points higher than men, significantly different. That's significant in a clinical sense, and significant in terms of statistical sense. Both groups are low on average. American diets have a lot to be desired, but in general, women are eating better than men. So the sort of discussion section of the paper, to summarize, we developed a methodology to link life cycle analysis data on greenhouse gas emission food to individual intakes in the U.S. There's a significant gender difference in greenhouse gas emissions from diet. Women's diets have less impact even after controlling for their energy intake. It's about 9% lower, smaller carbon footprint. Women consume higher amounts of several food groups, including fruits and vegetables, whole grains, plant proteins, dairy, and oils, and less of protein foods, meats, and solid fats. So all mostly good stuff. overall women's diets are healthier, as we noticed from the higher healthy eating index scores. And these methods will allow us to do future work on modeling the links between diets and health outcomes, but also on potential policy changes, which we'll hear from next. Hear from Amelia about next. There are some limitations about this. We only looked at greenhouse gas emissions. There are lots of different environmental impacts. And we only considered one-day diets. You know that what you eat today is not going to be the same as what you eat tomorrow. You didn't get a free lunch. You may not get a free lunch tomorrow, for example. And so we didn't consider usual intakes. And so that sort of spells out what our future directions are going to be. We're going to want, in the future, look at water and land use and those impacts. And we'll further disaggregate our diets by demographic characteristics. We'll look at different age groups. Turns out young people are consuming lower carbon footprint diets than older people. And then we'll also consider this idea of usual intakes by incorporating that second day of information. I'd like to acknowledge the people that were working here on this at Tulane, as also in terms of those in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and our funding from Wellcome Trust. And with that, that was my talk. I'll open it. Do we have a couple? Oh, it's passed. If there's a burning question of clarification, we'll take it. Otherwise, what we thought we would do is get through the 3 presentations so that people don't walk out in the middle of Brittany's, and we'll take questions at the end, if that's okay. You okay with that? Okay, the next 2 presentations, Amelia and Brittany, I think. This is just all scaled. Yes.
Oh, here we are.
There we go.
All right, I don't have a naturally loud voice, so you guys in the back row, if I get too quiet, just give me one of these. Thanks. All right, so building on what Diego just shared, I'm going to talk about some of our research that looks into how different food choices could actually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of our diets here in the U.S. So I didn't know how much turnover we would have. Some of this is a repeat, so I'll go very fast to make up some time. We know that climate change is a critical public health issue. The annual meeting of the APHA last year acknowledged that link. And since greenhouse gas emissions are a big part of agriculture, the foods that we grow and eat are important to our health, not only for nutrition, but also they're a potential way to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So one way that we can change the way people eat is through dietary guidance. And there's been a push in other countries to include sustainability as a component of dietary guidance, and also some interest in doing that here in the US. So the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is a group of experts that are put together every 5 years to review the evidence and then recommend what should be included in the dietary guidelines for Americans. And in 2015, that committee, looking at the evidence, concluded that in general, a dietary pattern that is higher in plant-based foods, such as vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and lower in animal-based foods is more health-promoting and is associated with lesser environmental impact than is the current average U.S. diet. So the committee emphasized that this kind of overall diet pattern is something that's achievable. You don't have to make extreme changes and eliminate entire food groups to have a diet pattern like this. And they recommended sustainability to be included in the 2015 dietary guidelines for Americans. That did not happen eventually because of politics. But from a nutrition perspective, this statement isn't surprising. We know that intake of these plant-based food groups is generally below recommendations in the U.S., and animal-based foods tend to be higher in saturated fats, as well as certain types of animal foods like cured meats are linked to other health issues. But from an environmental perspective, you'll notice the committee included multiple environmental impacts in their review. Again, our study just focuses on greenhouse gas emissions. And to revisit the slide that Diego showed, you can see from the environmental side why the statement makes sense, that if you're eating a dietary pattern with fewer of these foods on the right and more of these foods on the left, that the overall greenhouse gas emissions are likely going to be lower. But you can have a diet that's very, very low in greenhouse gas emissions, but eating only potatoes and tomatoes and apples all the time isn't going to be nutritionally sustainable in the long run. So this issue is complex, and the flip side of that statement is also true. So previous work has shown that the healthiest of diets aren't necessarily low in emissions. So this is an ongoing area of research trying to really identify where that win-win overlap is between diets that are healthier but also lower in impact. And there's So there's been some work, and they find a really wide range of possible greenhouse gas emission reductions from the dietary changes. And it seems like roughly 30 to 40% reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions associated with food is possible while still meeting nutritional needs. But once you start reducing beyond that, the acceptability of the diet starts to suffer. So it starts to become a very different set of food choices than the way people currently eat, so less likely to be adopted. And the other thing that's important to note is that this research tends to be, as Diego mentioned, looking at just an aggregate, like an average diet for an entire country. And then it calculates the impacts as though everybody in the country makes the changes. So that's not particularly realistic. We know that not everybody adopts dietary guidance, and different people choose their foods differently. So it's reasonable to think that some people who are more environmentally motivated might be more willing to adopt dietary guidance that centers around sustainability. So that's where our research comes in, working at the individual level. Our objective was to simulate potential responses to dietary guidance that seeks to reduce food-related greenhouse gas emissions. And to do that by identifying individuals who are likely to change their diets for environmental reasons, and then simulating the effects of those dietary changes both on the environment and on health. So the first two parts of the data sources that we needed to make this happen are the same as what Diego described. So the NHANES one-day dietary recalls, translated into commodity intakes, and measuring health using that healthy eating index. So I'm going to skip over that. Well, also a reminder that NHANES includes demographic information, which is part of what we use to help determine who would be likely to change their diets. And the healthy eating index is a measure out of 0 to 100. Higher scores are better, measuring how well a diet corresponds to the dietary guidelines for Americans. Our environmental impact data came from Datafield. So from that, we were able to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with individuals' commodity intakes. And then the last piece that we needed to be able to do this was a way to figure out who was likely to change. And NHANES tells us a lot about people, but it doesn't tell us anything about climate change or environmental motivations. So to get at this, we used a survey from Chatham House, which is a think tank in the UK. And this was part of a larger project to explore public understanding and behavior around climate change. It included lots of questions about how willing people are to change various types of behavior to limit their own contribution to climate change. So overall, to simulate the impacts when motivated consumers change their diets, we started out by calculating a beginning baseline greenhouse gas emissions and baseline healthy eating index, figured out who was going to change, ran the simulations on those changers, and then calculated a new resulting greenhouse gas emissions and healthy eating index. So a bit more visually, that looks like this, starting with those 7,000 foods from NHANES, converting them to commodities, using Datafield to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions associated with those foods. And then since we were working from commodity intakes, we needed to use a model to get HEI. And that model used not only the food intake, but also some demographic variables, and it was a very good predictor of actual HEI. So the next step is finding those environmentally motivated consumers. And to do this, we developed prediction models based on theory and testing that used variables that were common to both of these data sets. They were in Chatham House and they were also in NHANES. And the specific item we used out of Chatham House asked people, thinking about things you might do in order to limit your own contribution to climate change, how likely or unlikely would you be to make the following changes in the next year? Eating less meat or replacing the meat in some meals with alternatives such as beans. So they could answer that they're already doing as much as they possibly can for this, or they're certain to change all the way down to certain not to change. So to find the likely changers in NHANES, we built two models in Chatham House. And the first stage was looking for people who were already doing as much as they possibly can, because those people wouldn't be expected to change in any sort of simulation. And then within those who were left, the second stage identified who was likely to change. So, here. And so we built a predictive model for each of those stages and then used that model to impute predicted probabilities in NHANES. So when this was over, each individual in NHANES, all 13,000 of those people, would have a predicted probability to be already doing this and a predicted probability to be likely to change. And so then looking at that, we identified individuals who were not already doing as much as they can, and they were likely to change. So these were our changers. And of course, these were looking at predicted probability, so we had to choose a cut point to make this categorization, and we chose a cut point of greater than 50% probability. So the next step would be actually running those diet simulations on the changers that we found. We replaced some of the beef intake in the likely changers with poultry and also with plant protein foods. And when we did that plant protein replacement, that was done in the same proportion that the person already reported eating those 3 food groups, the legumes, the nuts and seeds, and the soy. And we did run different replacement scenarios, but the ones I'll be talking about today are equal calorie replacements. So if we were replacing 100 calories of beef, we would replace it with 100 calories of chicken. And then the last step would be calculating the outcomes of those simulated dietary changes. And we looked at the change in the mean greenhouse gas emissions and also the mean healthy eating index, both within those who changed and then overall in the population. So we found that about 10% of the sample were identified as likely changers, but not everybody actually ate beef on this day of intake. So the simulations were applied to about 6.6% of the overall sample. And starting out, the average greenhouse gas emissions of the diet were about 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per person per day. And replacing half of the beef with poultry in those likely changers reduced those food-related greenhouse gas emissions by about 20%. And doing the plant protein replacement reduced them about 23%. And just making those changes in the likely changers did show up a little bit in the overall population, reducing the food-related greenhouse gas emissions, the mean a little less than 2%. So did the healthy eating index change as a result of any of those substitutions? Within the changers, the poultry replacement did increase the HEI. Remember, HEI scores higher is better. It increased those scores 1.2%, and the plant protein replacement increased them 2.5%. But those changes were so small that they didn't show up at the population level. So in summary, replacing beef with poultry or plant protein foods in environmentally focused consumers did reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the diet. And environmental impacts of those changes are small at the population level, but they're substantial for those who change. And diet changes slightly improved the healthfulness of the diet in those who changed. So an important point, though, is that the percentage difference in greenhouse gas emissions at the population level might not look all that impressive, but with greenhouse gas emissions, the absolute amount matters also. So just doing that poultry replacement in the likely changers is equivalent to driving 38 million fewer miles in a passenger vehicle in just for one day. So this still matters. The strengths here are mainly the idea this is a realistic simulation, that only a few people were expected to change, people who were already motivated, and the changes they were expected to make were modest and realistic. I think Diego already covered pretty much the up-to-date greenhouse gas emissions piece and the limitations of the one-day diet, and the fact that sustainability is made up of multiple different components beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. In addition, because we were simulating changes to commodity food groups that may not exactly map onto how someone might go about changing their diet, say at the grocery store or looking at a restaurant menu. Future work would want to be looking at replacing meats other than beef or dairy with alternatives as well, and also looking at impacts other than greenhouse gas emissions and looking at usual intakes over time. So have some other people to thank as well, and same funding. So I don't know what time it is. Do we have time for questions? 1 minute.
We have 1 minute, or we can just go on to Brittany's and do that, and then ask the questions at the end.
Okay, I'm Brittany Kovacs, and I'm going to be presenting work on the carbon footprint of dietary guidelines around the world. So as we've been talking about, there are increasing rates of chronic disease around the world, and we know that diet plays a role in the prevalence and in the prevention of chronic disease. At the same time, we're also seeing increases in greenhouse gas emissions from the food system as populations continue to grow around the world, and also as populations continue to shift to diets higher in animal products. So this prompts this question: with all of these changes, what does a nutritious and a sustainable diet look like? Well, many countries around the world have already tried to answer the first part of this question by developing food-based dietary guidelines. Food-based dietary guidelines are nutritional advice provided by the government for the general public, and these are based on science. So in the US, for example, they're based on the DRIs. And they've been developed in over 100 countries around the world. And what's interesting about the food-based dietary guidelines is that they're all based on the nutritional requirements of a common human biology, but they're also shaped by geographical, economic, cultural, and social contexts in each country, as well as often politics of a country. Most previous research comparing food-based dietary guidelines has focused on either comparing the pictorial messages, such as my plate, or looking at qualitative comparisons of key messages within the food-based dietary guidelines. There is, however, a body of research that links food-based dietary guidelines with greenhouse gas emissions and compares them to current average population consumption patterns. So generally, this research has found that shifting from the average consumption pattern in a country to the recommended diet of a country reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So this has been found in a couple different countries: Australia, Germany, the Netherlands. However, when these studies are done in the US, we're not seeing the same sort of reductions. We're actually generally seeing increases. So some of our colleagues found only a 1% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions when shifting from the average US diet to the 2010 dietary guidelines for Americans and decreasing the calories to the recommended 2,000 calories per day. However, they saw a 12% increase in greenhouse gas emissions when shifting the food mix, but not decreasing the calorie intake. And Tom and colleagues have similar findings, finding 6% increase in greenhouse gas emissions when shifting the food mix and reducing calories, and an 11% increase in greenhouse gas emissions when shifting the food mix, but not reducing calories to the recommended level. So these differing results made us think about this question: what are the greenhouse gas emissions of recommended diets around the world, and how do they differ? So the study sought to complete a couple of objectives, including describing the differences in countries' recommended diets, developing a method to compare the food-based dietary guidelines of different countries by using food supply data to account for differences in current consumption patterns, and using our data field, our database of global warming impacts, and then also, of course, to examine differences in the global warming impact of countries' recommended diets. So 3 main data sources were used for this study. The first were the food-based dietary guidelines themselves, which provide the dietary recommendations. So most of these food-based dietary guidelines were pulled from FAO's food-based dietary guidelines catalog, where they house all of the countries' guidelines from around the world, and also government agency websites similar to USDA's site where the dietary guidelines for Americans is housed. Some inclusion criteria was developed to be able to conduct the type of analysis that was performed in this study. So first, guidelines had to have a list of clearly defined food groups, such as grains, and they had to have daily quantitative recommendations for each food group. This could be a specified amount of a food group per day, or a number of recommended serving sizes per day with a defined serving size. Also, guidelines were limited to those available in English or Spanish, which did limit the amount of guidelines we could look at. In the end, 7 countries were included in this study: Germany, India, the Netherlands, Oman, Thailand, the US, and Uruguay. So this is what we got for each country out of the guidelines. We had these 6 common food groups, and we had a daily recommended amount for each food group. And these were all based on a 2,000 calorie diet, or if a 2,000 calorie pattern diet was not available for the country, the closest thing to 2,000 calories. So our second data source were the Food and Agriculture Organization's food balance sheets. So one limitation of working with the dietary guidelines is that they might provide a recommendation for an amount of protein foods that you want to eat each day, say 100 grams, but they don't specify how much of that should be plant proteins, how much should be animal proteins, or get any more specific than that. So to work around this limitation, we used the food balance sheets to account for differences in apparent consumption among countries in these 5 different groups. So we used the 2013 food supply quantity data for 58 different commodities. So this gives us the kilograms per capita per year of a commodity available in a specific country. And proportions were created for all commodities within each food group and each country. For example, if you want to know the percentage of protein foods that's coming from beef in Uruguay, you would take the kilograms of beef in Uruguay that was available in 2013 over the total amount of protein foods available in 2013 to get that proportion. And there wasn't sufficient dairy data available in FAO's database, so we used a different data source to create similar proportions for 4 different dairy products. And our last data source, again, was data field for global warming impacts of foods. So this is based on life cycle assessment literature at the farm gate boundary. So it doesn't include any processing or any transportation impacts. And we applied the greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food from data field to the 58 commodities and 4 dairy products. And I'll walk you through an example of that. And some groups, some commodity groups were aggregate groups, such as nuts and products, which has a dozen different nuts. So for these aggregate groups, we created average values of all the different impacts of the commodities included in those groups. So to put these all together, I'll walk you through an example. This is the fruit group from the US. So if we wanted to know the greenhouse gas emissions associated with apples and products in the proportion that they're eaten, and if somebody was trying to eat the recommended 2 cups of fruit per day, this is what the formula would look like. We would take the recommended amount per day, multiplied by the proportion in which this commodity group is eaten, multiplied by the impact factor. There's a conversion factor here since we're working with cups for the US recommendations. And then we get this total kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per day. And we would repeat this process for all the commodities within a food group to get a total amount of greenhouse gas emissions that could be attributed to the fruit group recommendations in the US if somebody were to eat the recommended amount in about these proportions that they're eaten right now. So first, I'd like to summarize the food-based dietary guidelines that we worked with. Like I said, we're working with 2,000 calorie per day diets, or the closest thing to that. And we found that across the 7 countries, recommendations were provided for 6 common food groups: protein foods, grains, fruit, vegetables, dairy, and oils or fats. But we did find a number of differences among the 7 countries' guidelines. The first being the daily recommended amount of food groups, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute. This way ranged widely for all the different food groups. We also found that the grouping of certain foods was different, especially those foods that are included in the protein foods group. And we found these specific foods often were grouped into different food groups within the 7 countries. So first, I'd like to talk about the protein food group. As you can see, there's a wide range of different daily recommended amounts from 75 grams to 156 grams. If we look what's included in those protein foods, we see there's everything from only plant proteins to a mixture of animal and plant proteins. And if we look at the greenhouse gas emissions associated with eating the recommended amount of protein foods in each country, we see that the average is about 1.07 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per day. We also see that the percentage of total daily greenhouse gas emissions coming from protein foods increases as the amount of greenhouse gas emissions associated with eating the recommended amount of protein foods increases. And just the highest and the lowest, we see there's a big difference in India, which has a smaller recommended amount and is recommending pulses, compared to the US, which has the largest recommended amount of protein foods and is recommending a range of plant and protein foods. Now, I'd like to point out the example of Thailand, because you see that Thailand also has a larger recommendation for protein foods. but their greenhouse gas emissions associated with eating the recommended amount is much lower. And this is where the apparent consumption pattern comes in, the FAO food balance sheets. What I found in Thailand was that there's a greater availability of pulses, of fish, of pork, and poultry, which are two of the meats with lower impacts. And so that's why their greenhouse gas emissions are so much lower, even though they have a higher amount of recommended protein foods. The dairy food group we see also has a pretty wide range of recommendations, all the way from half a cup to 3 cups. The makeup of the dairy group isn't really different among the 7 countries, so I'll skip that part. We do see that there's, again, a big difference in greenhouse gas emissions among the 7 countries, but we don't see that the percentage of total daily greenhouse gas emissions coming from the dairy food group increases in the way that it did with the protein food group. What we do note, however, is just that the more dairy you're recommending in a country, the larger the greenhouse gas emissions are associated with eating that recommended amount. So for the whole diet, for all 6 food groups, these were the findings of the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita per day, if you were to eat the recommended diet in each of these countries. And again, we see that it's quite different among the 7 countries. To summarize, there are a number of differences in food-based dietary guidelines. The main common theme across the 7 of them were recommendations for 6 common food groups. Some foods were grouped differently, which did affect the apparent consumption pattern as well as the resulting greenhouse gas emissions. And the biggest difference was simply the daily recommended amount of each food. Like I mentioned before, these are all based on common human biology, yet we're recommending very different amounts of food groups in each country. And the greenhouse gas emissions of recommended diets. So all 6 food groups across all 7 countries had varying greenhouse gas emissions, and the protein food group did have the largest variation. And this ranged all the way, for the whole diet, it ranged from 0.86 to 3.29 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita per day. So in the US, in India, and the United States. So why did we find these differences? Well, first, a lot of it has to do with the food-based dietary guidelines themselves. Like I mentioned, the daily recommended amounts, especially for the protein and dairy food groups, which have the 2 largest impacts, those ones play a large role. And the grouping of foods, especially the foods that are included in the protein food group. So depending on what types of food, if they include meat, fish, if they include plant proteins, that has an effect on the protein food group's overall impact. And apparent consumption. So specific foods within a food group both influence a diet's overall greenhouse gas emissions based on their global warming impact, as well as their relative consumption. To give you a quick example, about 25% of protein foods in Uruguay comes from beef. As you saw before, beef has the highest impact of all protein foods. So because Uruguay's protein food recommendation is high and a significant portion of protein foods coming from beef, the resulting greenhouse gas emissions from the protein food group is much higher, and just for the diet overall. Another example, in Thailand, about 75% of grains come from rice, and rice is a grain that has a much higher impact than the other grains. So because Thailand recommends a large amount of grains each day, and a large portion is coming from rice, Thailand's overall greenhouse gas emissions associated with the recommended diet is higher, as well as that of the grain group. So limitations of this study, like I mentioned before, there's an inherent limitation with working with non-specific guidelines, so that's why we use the apparent consumption pattern. We only looked at greenhouse gas emissions. We know that water and land use also impact the sustainability of a diet, and this was limited to 7 countries, so it limits the generalizability of what we can say about the sustainability and the environmental impacts of recommended diets. In the future, we'd like to consider other impacts, look at other dietary patterns that are included in some of the food-based dietary guidelines, such as the vegetarian dietary pattern, and also expand the method to include more countries. And hopefully by doing some of these, we'll have a better idea of how to balance the nutrition and sustainability aspects of diets. So.
There's lots of time for questions as this seminar is scheduled from 12 to 1:30, so please ask questions to our speakers.
Do you have any idea what percentage of people actually follow the dietary recommendations for countries? Like you base all of this off of the dietary recommendations, what percentage of the population people follow them?
Can you repeat the question too?
Are you talking about in the U.S. or yeah?
Yeah, for
That's-
other countries as a general sense.
So the question is, what percentage of people actually follow the dietary guidelines in different countries? In the U.S., it's a really low percentage. I think it's under 10% that follow everything in the that would score. In fact, the scores that are upwards of 90 points on that is really small percentage. Probably under 5%.
Yeah. I think though why we're so interested in dietary guidelines is because a lot of other food and nutrition policies follow what the dietary guidelines say. So for example, school lunch program, at least in the US. So even though people may not necessarily follow the dietary guidelines, they do have a wide ranging impact across policy and across the food system.
Yes, so school lunch portions and school breakfast and childcare feeding, a lot of these things are based on what guidelines, they come out of what the guidelines are. So it's a policy that influences a lot of other things. We're basically wondering here, why is it that if we all have the same biology, why are the requirements so different from one country to the next? Or how are they different, I guess, actually. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have two questions. One of them, I don't really know about food, but what are pulses?
So there's a question about what are pulses?
So pulses are,
Like,
think of the nutrition.
pulses are legumes, basically.
Yeah, there is.
They're
Not
beans.
all legumes, but yes.
It's a subset
Lentils,
of legumes,
beans,
yeah,
and-
but it's not a term we use here in the US.
Yeah. Other questions? Alyssa in the back? Sorry. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, and my other question is, for the third study that you talked about, you looked at countries and the recommendations that each country has. Do you think it would be possible to look at a country's population too? Countries with larger populations maybe having stricter guidelines because overall they have a greater impact on greenhouse gas emissions?
So there was a question about whether the size of the country might influence the actual the dietary guidelines policy.
No, I haven't looked at the different populations, but that's something I could consider in the future.
Yeah, Alyssa, sorry.
Thank you so much for your presentation, each of you. It was very interesting. I know that for these analyses, you limited the greenhouse gas emissions to everything up to the farm gate. I'm wondering if it's technically feasible to extend that into processing, seeing as more and more people are eating more processed and packaged foods, not only in the United States, but in other countries.
So the question is that we looked at everything up to the farm gate. Could we also look at processing and the other parts of the food supply chain? So the challenge is, how do we look at what individuals are doing? And the connection from the commodities to individual diets was the way we went. And if we're going to look at commodities, that means taking it to the farm gate. Now that said, we did look at some processing. So we have, for example, cheese, we have tofu and yogurt, things that there was some processing on there was greenhouse gas emission data for, and that we could link directly to NHANES. But it gets a little bit challenging to the issue with NHANES is we don't know where people got their food from, right? So we know exactly what they ate yesterday, and there's all kinds of details about it, but it doesn't say, oh, those tomatoes came from Arkansas, or the beef was produced with organic method, cage-free eggs or whatever. We don't really know a lot beyond in the processing chain where they got their food, and so that makes it difficult to try to estimate those and to connect them to the campaigns.
Well, and our colleagues at Michigan, though, did try to do an estimate. There's another way to do the life cycle assessment where you kind of look from the top down to the bottom up. And so they tried to do that to try to estimate roughly how much were we missing by leaving out processing and transportation, I think it was. And I think it was like 15%, the amounts would be on average 15% higher from processing and on average 7% higher for transport. But that's just across the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, what that tells us is that we got the major
Yeah,
part.
we got a
By
lot
going
of
to Farmgate, we got the major difference between individuals. Yes. All right.
Thank you, guys. It was really very interesting, and it's important work, and I'm glad to see the connection. So you mentioned that these estimates don't include transportation, and obviously that's a really huge thing. You can have a wonderful vegan diet with soybeans imported from the Brazilian Amazon. So how should we think about that? Like individuals making choices. This could be great for guidelines, but what's some advice to individuals thinking about the choice between local and everything?
Right.
Put on a big plane and flown in, but having this amazing plant-based diet.
So there's actually, so the question was,
How do we feel? How do we account for that?
yeah, so the question is if you don't look at where the food is coming from
And how it's grown?
and how it's grown, how does that affect our estimates, and could we be off, and how does that affect our recommendations? So part of, there have been a number of studies that have looked at what are the contributions to greenhouse gas emissions from different parts, like what is the difference between, or what is the impact of food miles, the transportation part. And in general, those studies have shown that there's a lot more to do with which foods are chosen than where they come from. So the transportation miles, the eat local stuff, has a lot of reasons to support in terms of, creating community and alternative food systems and all that. But in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's swamped by eating beef, basically.
So if we take beef out, because that's such an outlier, then we're left with a range of decisions within.
If we take beef out, then we'd be doing a lot better. But yeah, no, that's a good point. What happens after you take beef out? You're kind of always thinking ahead there. No, I mean, that's a good point. What happens then? What would the differences be as dramatic, and would local make more of a difference? Well, what some of the studies indicate is particularly damaging when you think you're eating fruits and vegetables is if they're grown in greenhouses and imported by air freight. So that's like, double whammy, because you're growing them in a greenhouse, which is going to require all sorts of energy use for that, and then they're being flown in because produce is not going to last. Yeah.
I think that question too highlights a limitation in our ability to give recommendations to individuals at this point, because with labeling being what it is here, you might be able to see what country a produce item comes from, but you don't actually know how it was transported. It doesn't tell you that it came on a plane. So it's challenging.
If it's a strawberry or blueberry, it probably came on the plane.
Or asparagus out of season, that's another one.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there any variation? I don't know if you guys would know this, but do you know if there's any variation in greenhouse gas emissions depending on animal husbandry practices with beef, or is it all just like cows produce a lot of methane and that's the bottom line, doesn't matter if it's grass fed or whatever?
So we know a little bit. Marty would be able to answer this question better. So the question is, do you know if there's differences in greenhouse gas emissions based on the way that beef was produced, for example, whether it was range fed or grass fed or in huge facilities? We know something about that. We know that there's a lot of effort in this country to use the manure from cattle and to try to recover that in a biogas form. That sort of is an economic advantage for the farmer. It isn't necessarily an environmental advantage, because that energy then gets used, the methane then gets used. I think in general, and this is going to be surprising, there may be health So there's a couple things. If you have, there are certain lands that can't be used for growing food. So if you have range-fed land, grasslands, grazing animals on it would be the only thing that you could do on it. That would be advantageous. But the efficiency, if you're, all of this stuff is looked at as greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of edible portion, which means that the more efficient you can produce food, even if it creates a little bit more greenhouse gas emissions, if you produce a lot more of that with that method, overall there'll be less impact. And so that means that the sort of the feedlots that we have today are actually pretty efficient. They're pretty efficient compared to what they were 40 years ago. In the U.S., the efficiency and so greenhouse gas emissions have reduced for the same amount of beef, so that's good news for the beef folks, and they will trumpet out those studies. And if everybody can't eat the same amount of beef if it's coming from grass-fed beef, because you need more grass to do that. So it's kind of a nuance. There's some advantages to it because you're using land that can't otherwise be used. And if we go that way, it means everybody's got to cut down their beef because you can't grow as much beef. Yeah.
For the second presenter, could you repeat how you predicted whether or not someone would be a changer?
The changer. You know, we had those two data sets, the Chatham House one that was about 1,000 people. People were actually answering that question of, would you eat less meat to limit your own contribution to climate change? And so we separated that out because people who said they were already doing as much as they could. So it was a logistic regression model there, yes, no. And the predictors were all your basic demographics, age, education, occupation, whether they were vegetarian. And then the second stage, likely or not likely, so second logistic regression. And then taking those models and using the same variables that we had in NHANES to get predicted probabilities for both.
And the Chatham House one, though, that was UK based.
That was the US portion of their sample. They did 12 countries.
Okay.
Oh, I didn't repeat the question. Sorry.
That last question was about how are those likely changers? How was that done? Yeah, the UK. It's from the UK. It's a UK group that did it, but they did it. I think it was in 20 different countries, and they're online surveys. So they have like 1,000 responses from the US. Supposedly nationally representative, but not everybody uses online. So yeah.
I guess this is a question that's kind of prompted by an earlier one. In reviewing the literature, did you all find kind of any discussion of countries thinking about food intervention? So in the U.S., we kind of have our eating habits, and we're looking at changing, and they fluctuated some with trends and with demographic changes, but it's been largely stagnant. Versus if you look at like China, has a tremendous growing middle class. They're not just their protein consumption in general and non-plant protein is growing tremendously fast. Did you find that any governments or any groups are thinking about how do we work these, whether they're national regulations or supplies or whatever, to have a more sustainable model?
So the question was, did we find in our reviews of the literature there were countries that were trying to implement policies to address food changes that would contribute to...
They could project as harmful.
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't focus on interventions in my research. I really was focused on the dietary guidelines. However, another paper associated with this work, there is a table in it where there's a list of about a dozen or so countries that have somewhere in their official dietary guidelines, they do make mention of different aspects related to sustainability and do recommend these various aspects, whether it's to eat more plant proteins, to eat less meat, to eat seasonally, to eat a more diverse diet. There are a number of different recommendations. So we are seeing that in some countries, but not that many. And I'm not sure about the interventions. We haven't really explored that.
I mean, there's a policy ladder, they call it sometimes. What's the weakest policy that you can do, and how do you go up the ladder to implement more policies, more stronger policies? And the thing is, the further up you get the ladder, the more effective the policy might be, but the more resistance you're going to get to implementing it. So something like dietary guidance, we already have that. It's a kind of a weak policy. You put, it's information basically. Whereas something like labeling would be similar to that, maybe a little bit more, a little bit stronger because it's in front of you when you pick up the food. Something like taxes would be a stronger policy, but there's going to be lots of resistance to that. There have been studies. I don't know of countries that have implemented taxes, but there are definitely studies that have looked at carbon taxes and what that would do to. So if you have a carbon tax, that means certain foods are going to be pricier, which means that they'll be consumed less, higher, supply and demand. But there's still a long way to go on this whole area. I think there was, Laura, another question?
Oh, just wondering where you're all going with the research. What's next? Is it going on?
Yeah, these 3 papers are getting written up, and so that's the first step. Always one of the challenges while we're doing everything else is to publish this stuff. We have we have actually got an extension on this grant, and so what we're going to be looking at during this year is what are the water and land impacts, not just greenhouse gas emissions. And that's kind of an exciting new area. The folks at Michigan are taking the lead on this because what they're going to actually look at is not just how much water is used in growing crops, but where is it grown and is there a scarcity in that area. So obviously if you grow a tomato in Michigan, it's quite a different impact than if you grow a tomato in California because up until last year there was drought years and years in California. So it's actually going to be scarcity weighted water use, and so we're going to do that. On our end, we're also connecting food prices to this. So what we want to be able to do is if we have a recommendation for something that's less impactful, what does that matter in terms of will it be affordable? Are we only can we find something that is affordable and healthy and with low impact and the positive deviance that Amelia's been working on. And so let's see what else. Are there other things we're trying? I think connecting.
Usual intakes.
Yeah, usual, and then also doing usual intakes. Combining the information on both days of diet to look at what's there's statistical methods for looking at what's the usual dietary intake of a population. Yeah.
One of my questions is going to be if you're going to incorporate anything related to cost, but also thinking about what would it take to get this incorporated into policy and specifically into the dietary guidelines since it's gotten so much pushback and still is getting that. And wondering about the ability to look geographically across the country and thinking about the concentration and burden of diet-related diseases and how there might be some linkages there, if that would be some additional motives for incorporation of this additional guidance in the guidelines.
So yeah, let me see if I can remember what those were. So the last question you asked is, are we going to be looking at dietary problems across the country, how they differ, and why that, and whether that might be motivation to incorporate this? And I guess the first question was, there's been resistance to incorporating sustainability into dietary guidance. Amelia mentioned this in her presentation. There was a whole chapter on it from the expert committee, and when it got to the government, they excised that chapter. There's political pressure to do that. I'll start by saying that we're not very optimistic in the next, so the dietary guidelines are updated every 5 years, and so they're already starting to choose who's going to be on the committee for the 2020-2025 guidelines. We might take a step back. It wouldn't surprise me if that happens, just given that these are chosen by the government in power. We actually have it hasn't been accepted yet, but we have a position paper that we've written for the Society for Nutrition Education and Behavior calling for the inclusion of sustainability into guidance. So we're trying to push the envelope, at least in the professional community. And maybe on the next cycle, maybe not this next one, but the following one, we'll get some inclusion of that. I think your idea about looking at geographic problems is a really good one, and it might be a way that we could start doing more local activities around this. So thanks for that. Any other questions? So on that, we'll close. Did you have something you need to do to?
Oh, well, I just want to thank our speakers again for coming today. If everyone could